to have a gavel. So I would like to start, as our panel is getting seated. Welcome everyone to what we are calling the Triple Academies Symposiums. I'm Cherry Murray. I'm Dean of the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. And when I got an email from Lance Davis saying, how would you like to host a regional NAE meeting? I thought about it and said, gee, that would be fun. And what should it be on? And then I thought a little bit more and said, might be interesting on security and privacy of data and medical records. Gee, but we can't do that without IOM. And so had a little email exchange with both Chuck and Harvey about how about a joint NAE IOM symposium. And so they were enthusiastic. And then I was looking for a venue. And well, there isn't any place around Harvard that will host the number of people that would come to this. And so, but the American Academy is a wonderful venue. So I contacted Leslie Berlowitz and said, we're going to have this symposium. She said, well, but it's during my council meeting, but gee, it's an awfully interesting topic, and I'll co-host. So now we have 3 academies, and we have members of NAE, IOM, and the American Academy invited, and a few select Harvard fellows, faculty, and students, and some MIT students as well. And I really want to extend my thanks to our host, the American Academy, and Leslie Berlowitz, which is absolutely fantastic, making room for us in the middle of her council meeting. I'd also like to, of course, thank Chuck and Harvey, the presidents of the NAE and IOM, and the members of the program committee, who are Harry Lewis, Salil Vadan, and Jonathan Zittrain. All of them are members of the computer science faculty at Harvard, and some have other affiliations. They spent a very long time thinking about what would be, and trying to figure out who would be the right people on the panels. And then they ran into an issue with a major genetics conference going on at the same time. So we were extremely happy that our esteemed panelists could make it despite that. We'll spend the next 2.5 hours discussing what is one of the more challenging and defining issues for our time, which is how do you actually use information to further medicine, and how do you make sure that that information is secure and private. And this depends on a lot of things, including the culture that we live in, whether we, wherever we are in the world. Privacy, and certainly privacy depends on culture, and it's defined differently and felt differently in Europe and Asia and the US, for example. So as a global medical enterprise, how do we deal with that? Before I do that, I'd like to introduce Leslie Berlowitz, Executive Director of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We're really grateful for Leslie's advice in planning. And it turns out the reason she was interested is that the American Academy has had considerable interest in this over the years. They've done some important work on related policy issues, including the spread of personal genetic information. We also worry about the public understanding of these complex issues, and the American Academy has been working on that quite a bit. Also, scientists' understanding of the public and the public perception. So Leslie, please.
I'm going to be real quick because I actually have a board sitting across the hall, and anyone who knows a lot about boards knows you don't really let them meet without you. Nevertheless, I really am delighted to welcome you on behalf of the board of the American Academy. We are so delighted to have the national academies, including the National Academy of Engineering and the Institute of Medicine, to be together here, and as well as guests from MIT and Harvard. We're especially honored to have our fellows, Chuck Vest, Harvey Feinberg, Jeffrey Flier, and Sherry Murray, collaborating on this program. All of our organizations are concerned with basic and applied knowledge and the impact of scientific discovery on society. Advances in science, medicine, and engineering, including the increasing speed and declining cost of gene sequencing techniques, presents very complex legal, social, and ethical challenges, and today's symposium focuses on the implication of largely unregulated access to personal genetic information. As Sherry indicated, we have had some workshops associated with this topic, and in fact, some of your participants have also worked with us as they examined, and I won't go through all that, but I know you have a wonderful expert panel. Their work led to, among other things, a publication called Do Scientists Understand the Public? There are copies out, I think, at the front desk, and it's on our website. And I would commend that essay, which was written by Rick Moody, based on the work of our workshops, to grapple with some of the questions. Because I have to go to the governing board meeting, I will not get to listen in, but I know it's being recorded, and I really look forward to hearing and watching the proceedings, and I look forward to welcoming you along with Sherry at the cocktail party we've planned afterwards. Universities have football teams and tailgate parties. Harvard and MIT certainly fill some of that here in Cambridge. We have cocktail parties, and all teams win. So with that, let me turn the program back.
So I would also like to give both Harvey and Chuck a few minutes to say some thoughts. We're very fortunate to have Harvey Feinberg here with us. He is the president of the Institute of Medicine. However, he earlier in his life served as provost of Harvard University, so he's back in his stomping grounds. He was also dean of the Harvard School of Public Health. Harvey?
Thank you, Cherry. I just want to add my word of greeting and welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to see you. I know that you are as eager as I am to hear this panel, and I look forward, as you do, to learning what they have to say. Thank you all for being here.
Now I will introduce Chuck Vest, the president of the National Academy of Engineering and former president of MIT, so he's also in his stomping grounds.
Well, Leslie said she was going to be brief because she had a board meeting. I'm going to be brief because I don't want to have a bored audience. So I'm going to be even faster than my good friend Harvey Feinberg. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Okay, now I will do some logistics. There are two panels. They're up on the screen, which you can read. So in keeping with being brief, I will not read them to you. The aim of the panels is to be interactive, and however, we're videotaping this symposium, so if you have a question, you need to raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. First of all, we do want it to be lively, so do ask questions. The first panel, Jeff wants people to be able to speak first and then questions after the final panelists have come. So save your questions, write them down. And we will have a cocktail party after the event. Everyone is, Leslie and I are co-hosting, everyone is invited. So without further ado, Jeff Flier at Harvard is on.
Thank you, Cherry, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's very exciting for me to be able to moderate this discussion. The topic is extremely important and extremely timely, and an extraordinary panel has been assembled, and these individuals, their skills and contributions have been in a wide variety of areas, reflecting the breadth of interest in this topic and the implications of the topic. I personally am approaching this from the view of the Dean of Harvard Medical School. By way of background, I've been a physician scientist for 30 years. My interest in diabetes and obesity at various points has involved trying to understand the genetic basis, unfortunately at a time before some of the power available today was available. But in the role of being dean of this medical school, I'm now constantly involved in questions related to this topic as they relate to medical education, as they relate to patient care, as they relate to basic and clinical research, as they relate to research ethics, as they relate to healthcare policy broadly, as they relate to our desire to accelerate biomedical innovation, and other topics as well. The reason for this great connectivity is the fact that the topic really lies at the intersection of many critical areas in biomedicine. So the science and technology of genetics, genomics, and bioinformatics are advancing very rapidly and really in an almost unimaginable way, changing daily, weekly, monthly, and certainly yearly, both in terms of concept and the ability to implement. Biomedical ethics is closely related to all of the topics that arise, and it is a challenge for this field of biomedical ethics to keep up with the potential variations of how the field can advance. The legal system and the system of enforcement of laws also has a challenge as things are happening very quickly. There has not yet been legal theory, perhaps, to underlie the response to it. The role of the legal system in this is a very important topic that we'll hear about today. How should this relate to business entrepreneurship? There are many individuals and companies and entrepreneurs seeking to take advantage of the tremendous power that is now available, and how should they be organized and permitted to push the envelope in the field alongside the academics who are doing this for purely academic reasons. And finally, the topics that we're discussing are really connected to our deepest views of our values personally regarding privacy, autonomy, and broad social values. So the panel over the next few minutes is going to be discussing three broad, somewhat overlapping topics. One will, let's say, focus on privacy. Second, related to ethical and legal issues that I've intimated. And perhaps a third would be how shared genetic information might be deployed, along with all the concerns and caveats that relate to that deployment to improve the public welfare. So at this point, what I'd like to do is start at my left and ask each of the panelists to just identify themselves, say a little bit who they are and how their own personal, professional experiences got them together with this area. And after maybe a minute and a half or 2 minutes of each person doing that, I'll pose some questions and ask people to begin to respond.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name's Phil Reilly. I'm a clinical geneticist and an attorney. I've spent most of my professional career thinking about genetic disease. And I would say my views about the topics today have been formulated in two ways. One, I spent many years in charge of the care of about 1,000 mentally retarded individuals for whom there was no diagnosis for probably 80 to 95% of them. These were institutionalized individuals. And many of them had, I thought, genetic disorders, but we didn't know what they were. Currently, though, I'm in a very different world, and that is I'm in the world as a venture capitalist and my entire life is devoted right now to starting companies to try and treat genetic disorders for which there's currently no available therapy.
Thank you.
I'm George Church, professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School. My route into this has mostly been from the technology. I've watched up close and personal this possible million-fold improvement in cost effectiveness over the last 6 or 7 years. One could say maybe even participated in that a little bit. And as we saw it coming around 2003, we saw that there was the paradox of the NIH and others wanting to simultaneously make the data available to a very broad number of researchers and to promise to the research subjects that they would keep it totally private. And so when we launched the Personal Genome Project, this was one of the things we tried to tackle head on by specifically seeing if it was possible to recruit cohorts that understood these issues well enough to permit their data to be shareable broadly without over-promising.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Christine Patch, and as you can tell, I'm not from the USA, I'm from the UK. In my day job, I'm a nurse and genetic counsellor, and I see families and individuals affected in the main by high-risk genetic disorders where if they have the gene, they're at high risk of developing the condition, and seeing people with rare syndromes. I think I've been invited on this panel because I've also spent some time on the UK Human Genetics Commission. I'm not a member now, so any opinions I express are my own. But as part of that commission, I chaired a working group which produced a report called More Genes Direct, which led to the development of a framework of principles for good practice in the area of direct-to-consumer genetic testing. And I've also been involved in the European Society of Human Genetics in developing policy statements in this area, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
My name's Hank Greely. I'm also from a distant and strange country. I'm from California. I'm a law professor at Stanford. For the last 20 years, my work has focused on ethical, legal, and social issues in the biosciences, starting with genetics, then stem cell research, increasingly neuroscience. Privacy is an issue throughout all of those. I've got thoughts on lots of areas of genetics and would like to be on the second panel as well as the first. But on the privacy side, I think my work is focused on two things. One is trying to set up things so that people aren't damaged, so that we avoid as much harm, real harm to people as possible. And second, trying to avoid harm to the scientific enterprise, harm that would come about if the practices of science and of medicine were sufficiently different from what people thought they were, that the discovery of that discrepancy led people to feel embittered, cheated, upset with science. I think that would be a bad thing as well.
My name is Latonya Sweeney. I'm from yet another foreign land. I come from computer science, so in this space. But I felt like I've come in life in a most exciting time, a time where for the last 10 years, for the last decade or so, I've constantly seen these clashes between technology and privacy. And it doesn't actually have to be that way. We often find ourselves feeling that society has to choose privacy or the benefits of the technology. And what I've been really successful at doing is finding these sweet spots where society can enjoy both the new benefits as well as the privacy. And each challenge, whether it's privacy-preserving surveillance after 9/11, whether it's been medical privacy data in general, or even has been increasingly more and more difficult, but clearly none of them as difficult as pharmacogenomics and genetic data. It's brought forward a new challenge. Because so the idea is, how is it then that we think about privacy in the light of so much information about one's individual that's so personal? And I've been fortunate to have been able to be here on sabbatical from Carnegie Mellon for the last 2 years, actually. And that's allowed me the space and opportunity to sort of rethink privacy, sort of say, look at the historical protections and see in what way they no longer hold. They don't give us the same kind of social utility that they did in the 70s. And ask, what then could we replace those instruments with that could be technology powered, that could give us the same kind of protection and benefits in today's society? So I'm excited. So thank you for having me here, and look forward to more.
Okay, great. So I thought what I would do is start off first little segment by posing a couple of questions on the topic of privacy. And this is how I would summarize it. So how do we assess the needs for and capacity to deliver privacy, often in this area referred to as anonymization regarding genetic information? So how much privacy is possible? What is the limit of what we can actually achieve in various settings? How much privacy is necessary? Even if we couldn't achieve it entirely, would that be okay, and in what sense? What are the privacy issues unique to genetic information that are fundamentally different, if there are any, from other kinds of information that could be available and lead to a loss of privacy? And is there, the term has been used, of genetic exceptionalism? Do we taking a unique view of the power of genetics to lead to problems with privacy? Also, given that individuals seem empirically to vary in their views on this topic, both regarding the opportunities and the risks, what possible models could be developed to accommodate this variation? And I'll just mention three for you to talk about. The first, at one extreme, would be what's been referred to as the medical altruists. Those are people who would agree in a fully informed way to have their personal information employed in the public domain. And we have one of them sitting on the panel, two to my left. A second would be to develop some kind of detailed system for consent that has the capacity to either opt in or opt out, development of a partnership between the investigators, scientists, doctor, and the patients in this way, some kind of evolved approach to informed consent that would both protect individuals, subjects, and the system. And then what about attempts to develop a foolproof protection for privacy versus clear rules and clear punishments, knowing that you couldn't really ever fully deliver a foolproof system? Ultimately, in all of these, it's a question, I think, of risks versus benefits. And there we have to figure out how do you measure the risks and the benefits, and who should decide what are the relevant risks and benefits, centralized versus decentralized approach, and what's the role of various experiments that might be ongoing to test one or more of these systems. So with that as the setup, I'm going to turn it to the panelists. And perhaps I'll start with George Church. Just say a word about how he sees these issues. Anyone he wishes to comment on?
Well, I agree that there's a wide range that needs to be respected in terms of what people want in terms of privacy. Some individuals completely cover their face whenever they're in public, and this is obviously their right and culturally respected. And the same thing applies for genomic information, where we know less about it. So one of the things that, as we look to develop new paradigms and see whether we have foolproof methods or not, because we don't know we have foolproof until well into the phase 4 trials on privacy, what we need is a set of individuals who have agreed to take the risk. We won't promise them anything, but then we will subject them to varying degrees of foolproofness. And then if it fails, they've already agreed to full disclosure, and it's an interesting test case. And so the Personal Genome Project, ironically, has now got involved in a number of collaborations and grants where the goal is to achieve foolproof privacy and security.
Okay. Hank, would you like to say something on that?
Sure. First, on the genetic exceptionalism point, which I think is very important. People often think of genes as being special, different, requiring special legislation from everything else. I actually am not a genetic exceptionalist. I think genetic exceptionalism is a bad thing. I think it causes us to both worry too much about genes and worry too little about other things that can be equally powerful. I am, however, a health exceptionalist, particularly with respect to privacy. I have privacy concerns about my credit card receipts. I have privacy concerns about my web browsing. They may, in some cases, be greater than my privacy concerns about my health records, but I care about my health records a lot, and I care about who has access to them and how I can interpret them, because health, I think, is, for a variety of reasons, exceptional. Genetic information, to the extent it is health information, I think needs more consideration about privacy than some of the other electronic areas. I do think, however, that the many benefits coming from electronic data storage and manipulation are so strong that to some extent we're going to be pushed, we're going to be lured more than pushed to Scott Neely's comment about you have no privacy, get over it. It's a real strong pull that way. What I worry about most is not so much ending up with very little privacy, it's ending up in a world where most people think they've got a lot more privacy than they have, which I think is the world we're in right now. People think things are a lot more private than they are. When they find out that they are less private than they thought they were, than they believe that their doctors and their health insurers and their researchers assured them they were, I worry about a bad backlash.
Now, Christine, how much privacy do people think they have in the UK, and what would you like to say about that?
I mean, I think people assume they have a lot of privacy in the UK, and it's an underpinning presumption of the sort of how we work in healthcare. There's various acts, Data Protection Act, et cetera, that protect people's right to privacy. They expect their medical information to be confidential. The history of the electronic health records has been fraught with problems, and we've yet to see whether it will exist or not. But it did cause a backlash in terms of concerns about people's health information potentially being made available and being less secure. But of course, the benefits of having a transportable medical record that you could get at anywhere in the country was, to me, might outweigh the potential loss of privacy. I'm very much agree with George. I think it's important that we have a relationship of trust in the clinic, and as researchers we have a relationship of trust with our participants, and that trust has to be based on a relationship of truth, in a sense. And so therefore I do think it's important that people don't assume they have more privacy than they have, or in fact assume they have less privacy than they have. And again, the genetic exceptionalism argument, I think genetics information is no more or less important than other health-related information.
Okay. Latonya, would you like to add?
Sure. I'd like to jump in. So when I look at genetic information, and in particular I've been working a lot more in the space of pharmacogenomics, so the idea that it's not just my genetic data, but also my medical information attached to that. And it's pretty identifying, and so it began to question these cornerstones that we've historically thought of, like the idea of consent that George brings up. To what extent can one actually know the long-term consequence of releasing that data? Well, you can't, because part of where we are in time is a discovery process in the science of what we can learn from that. So there's a lot of studies in the economics of privacy that say even if it wasn't genomic data, people have a horrible time calculating their risk and harms downstream. And historically, that's been the role of privacy policy because people were often in that position. Notice is another historical cornerstone that we've had to protect. We sort of see that with these click-through agreements on the web and so forth. Well, you notice you could choose otherwise. But increasingly, we're soon going to be to the point where it's impossible to not believe that part of my genetic information is not going to be associated with my medical record solely in the benefit of treating me. Because the more you know about diseases and the relationship to genetic information, it will almost be malpractice not to have done certain genetic tests and those results be included in my record. So this isn't even just about research, it's also about the way medical records themselves will be. And so the idea of notice, well, I can't really opt out of care. I can't opt out of not having these genetic tests and so forth. So again, yet another cornerstone doesn't quite work again in this space. And de-identification is certainly not possible for two reasons. It might be possible 10 years from now to actually anonymize or de-identify genetic data, but it's not possible now because we don't know what it is we need on the utility side. We don't know what pieces we need, and so therefore I need all of it. And if I need all of it, I can't really de-identify it because it's you, and more, there's so much data in today's society, so many ways to re-identify, so many autonomous collections of information about you held by people you've never even heard and would have no way of knowing, and all of that data can be brought to bear to re-identify you. So here are the three cornerstones, and they kind of all got thrown right out the window when you look at it. And so one of the things we start thinking about, so you back up and you say, well, what's the problem? Well, the first problem, or the biggest problem, is harms. Harms that can come to the individual whose data is being shared either with their knowledge or without their knowledge, with their consent or without their consent. The point is that they could suffer economic harms. And so to what extent can you insulate them from economic harms? And clearly many people on this panel have thought about that and were pushed forward with GINA as a law to help do that. But GINA is only part of the kinds of harms an individual could suffer. So it's the kind of things that we've been looking at more recently with colleagues here at Harvard, actually, and at MIT, have been the notions like data sharing insurance. That is, to what extent could you actually build a model of data sharing insurance so that if someone were to participate in the Personal Genome Project or some other activity, and they were harmed downstream, a consequence they couldn't foresee, could we have had an insurance model that sort of provides them some benefit back for economic harms? Another model that's very popular in other ways with things that are happening today is the idea of turning over data, more and more data, to the individual's control and allowing them to put that data wherever they'd like. So in some sense, the Personal Genome Project is an example of that. And so are medical record banks and so forth. But what we propose is also, I might think of that as a marketplace, because one of the ways we could do is we could design a marketplace where the value of the data provided to a researcher or for other use is actually set by how much risk that person would be at if they engaged in that sharing. And so the idea is some compensation for harm on the front end. And so these are the kinds of ways I've been thinking about it.
Thank you.
For those of you who aren't into the genetics world, GINA, which Latonya mentioned, is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act passed in 2008, prohibiting the use of genetic information to discriminate against people in employment and in health insurance, though not in life insurance, disability insurance, or long-term care insurance.
Thank you for that clarification.
Or what school you get into.
So Philip, can you add a perspective that would also include how entrepreneurs would relate to these issues that have just been discussed?
Well, I promised to get there, but that's not where I'll start.
Okay, start wherever you like.
Thank you. So I'd like to strike a note of optimism about genetic information and make a few comments that flow back to your questions, Jeff. First of all, for the most part, I don't think genetic information is terribly different from medical information. I can make some distinctions. For example, for monogenic single gene conditions, if I discover that I'm a carrier for a gene, it's certainly of interest. It's certainly relevant to my brother because he has a 1 in 2 risk perhaps of having that disorder or a risk for that disorder. So the familial aspect is a little bit different. I'd like to also remind us, for those of us who don't know, that we have a more than 40-year history of gathering genetic information about people in the Western world and storing it and using it and protecting it, and that's newborn screening. And if you look historically at the history of newborn screening in the United States, we test virtually all of the 4 million babies born in this country. We now, in many states, collect 50 bits of information about each one of them, so that's on the order of 200 million bits of information a year. And there is virtually no evidence whatsoever that anyone has suffered an economic harm because of newborn screening. I think it's been appropriate to think about the risks that we were talking about today, and I'm sure there are some that will manifest, but I think that they are outweighed by the benefits quite clearly. And when I think about this issue, I think about 2 issues within privacy: protecting access to the information and protecting from harms against misuse of it once access has been somehow violated. And I think that it's quite possible in a society like ours to build in, and indeed I would argue in the common law and elsewhere, there are already perhaps crude and inefficient but existing mechanisms to protect against misuse. Now you did ask me, and I promised I would, to say something about how I approach it with the particular burden I carry in life right now of trying to start these companies. Let me just give you one example. And it's not important that you know about the disease, but I've just spent the last year of my life thinking and working quite hard on a disease called adrenoleukodystrophy, which is in one form, a fatal childhood disorder. It's a very mysterious disease with at least 5 to 7, depending how you define them, different phenotypes, yet all related to mutations in the same gene. Why is it that some people develop a fatal disorder at age 5 or 6 or 7, and others develop a relatively mild disorder at 45? To answer that question, I'm sure if I turn to this gentleman in his lab, he could probably, with relatively little money and relatively few samples through GWAS studies or sequencing, help me understand that, because there's probably modifier genes. Taking it one step further, we now have a newborn screening test for this disorder, which will, and this is where I think where some of the real dilemmas lie, not in economic harm or insurance discrimination, but just what does it mean to tell people that you've made a discovery about something? What does it mean to their perception of themselves, their family, their prospects and possibilities in life? I look at expanding newborn screening for adrenoleukodystrophy, which is imminent, and probably we have the test, it'll happen in 5 years or 3 years or whatever, as a way to learn much more about the natural history of the disorder, but I have to pierce privacy to do that. But I think the benefits to those families at risk will be dramatic. Also, it will raise the issue of being able to know a child at birth is at high risk, about a 1/3 chance of developing a fatal disorder in childhood, and it may trigger a new era where instead of waiting until the disease becomes manifest and it's a rapidly deteriorating disease, we might be able to intervene much earlier and make a difference. So I come down squarely in favor of the growing use of genetic information and believing that it will benefit us in many ways, and that the privacy issues are, if not completely solvable, are manageable.
Thank you.
Can I just reply to a couple of comments about the newborn screening? So after having spent a tremendous amount of time trying to save those blood spots that were collected in Texas that are now being burned, it's really clear. So here what we have is a collection of blood spots from children who are engaged in newborn screening, and the data was kept on cardboard and kept locked away, and no other use was ever made of that. And on the other hand, you could say, my God, these children are now adults, they've had lives, we could look at their medical records, think of all the things we could learn, and all we have to do is sequence those blood spots. But the courts in Texas decided not in our favor, despite our attempts to say how we might go about doing that in a privacy-preserving way, and ordered them all to be destroyed. And state by state, that's the decision that every state is making. So yeah, there's been no problems with newborn screening, because you know what? Nobody's used the data since newborn, you've not touched it. So we don't really want to do that. We don't want to use the data one time and put it in a vault, and that's the end of it. So the question is, how do we allow this kind of reuse? And when we look at access controls, which you said, which Philip brought up, the problem with access controls historically, when we look at sort of like American jurisprudence, well, there's the trusted third-party model, where it could be an IRB who makes a decision, or it could be a judge that makes a decision. There could be regulation where it's just sort of dictated. This is what's going to happen, sort of like HIPAA is like that, and public health laws, you're going to have to give this data. But I think that the volume and magnitude of the information around the person and the kind of data that we're talking about is so magnanimous that not to have the individual as a first-hand party to the decision-making around the control is a formula for a disaster, another burning of the data.
Yeah, I actually want to go, I think the Texas example is a great one, but I read a slightly different lesson from it. So those blood spots had been collected for years. Texas actually did allow a few of them to be used for some research purposes. The parents of the children, some of whom were now adults, some of whom were newborns still, didn't know, A, most of them didn't remember or ever know that there ever was such a test, B, had no idea the blood spots were saved, and C, had no idea that they were being used for research. Some of the research, which I think was completely benign, happened to involve the FBI's CODIS database for criminals. And so parents thought, they're sending my kid's DNA to the FBI, and had all sorts of concerns. To me, and it led to litigation, which ultimately led to the destruction of these 4.2 million samples. To me, that's a story about the mismatch between public understanding and expectations, public knowledge, and scientific practice. And in that case, I think Texas, if it was going to go forward with it, needed to educate people, probably give them an option to consent, opt in or opt out, which ultimately is what they're doing going forward. But that mismatch is what caused the controversy, caused the conflagration in which 4.2 million blood spots were pitched.
So I'm going to actually pose another couple of quick questions, because we're running out of time as we set it up. We'll go to questions in about 5-7 minutes or so, but let me just throw out a couple of questions. In the broad area of informed consent, which runs through everything that is being said, can subjects ever truly be fully informed, given the context of science and time in the future that we're talking about for some of these instances, as you mentioned, you take a spot of blood when the baby's born, what can be consented can't even be imagined, during the lifetime of that individual. So if you could each try to make some comment about that. And then another critical issue that's only been touched on is this issue of reporting of results. So what is either the obligation to report back to the patient something about their findings if they should be found? And is there an obligation to rescue in this sense? Or, in fact, is it so complicated that you literally have to put a firewall such that there would be no ability to find out something that could then be reported to a patient? So let me stop there and ask whichever one of you would like to comment first. Yeah.
And say that, there's some interesting models of consent being developed for the UK Biobank, and there's a longitudinal survey of children born in the 90s in the west of England, where the consent is to store the samples, link it to data long term with no consent for specific studies. But what has been set up is governance councils, users councils, et cetera, so there's an ongoing relationship between the participants in the research and the researchers, and that relationship, as I said before, is based on trust. And I think that's a very interesting model for these long-term epidemiological studies.
But an individual subject wouldn't ever be queried as to whether they wish their sample to be utilized for a particular purpose?
No.
Would anyone like to comment on that issue?
Well, if I could come back to your original question, I'd like to just clarify a couple points. And I think this is actually a very interesting phenomenology. Newborn screening in the United States began in 1962. It's widespread, it's state-based, and by and large, it's mandatory. There are some exceptions, and there's some deviations from the model. So, in fact, informed consent has nothing to do with newborn screening. Now, that model may change, but it would be at great economic cost, and I don't think the public health departments of the states in America are going to go anywhere near that. There's a kind of public health doctrine that permits this in the best interest of the child. To my knowledge, there's only been a handful of cases in which this notion of mandatoriness has been challenged. One over PKU screening in the Supreme Court of Ireland, where the parent's right to refuse mandatory testing was upheld. Secondly, back to your question about fully informed consent. The source for most of our discussion about consent are a set of federal regulations written more than 2 decades ago, in which the word fully is not really there as a modifier. Obviously, there's no such thing as fully informed consent. So I think our model should be adequate consent using, say, a reasonable person standard. And I actually think that's quite easy to meet in research. I think, if anything, the problems I have seen faced with research for rare genetic disorders is an over-eager subject population because they have largely been abandoned by the healthcare industry and, in fact, the NIH in terms of the amount of dollars allocated to rare disorders. I just see people calling me up all the time about this.
Hank, do you want to pose a view on that?
Well, I agree with Phil, although I would note that we all see different pieces of the elephant, and the population he sees is an unusual part of the population. People with children who are desperately ill, who are desperately searching for knowledge and they hope some treatments, and who have felt appropriately abandoned. Most of the population, I think, is not going to be knocking on your door, eagerly offering you their DNA. Some people will. I think that the consent, clearly we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We can't have fully informed consent. We can certainly have fully uninformed consent. We need to be somewhere in between. The reasonable man position is a good one. I want to raise a slightly different privacy issue. For me, this is an example of a mismatch between public expectations and reality. Some of you may remember the BTK killer, the nasty serial killer in Kansas. He was caught a few years ago. In part, they had plenty of crime scene DNA, but there was no one in the database who matched him. They got through the printer he used. They had a suspicion about who it was, an upstanding member of the community. They didn't want to arrest him, so they tried to get some DNA evidence to link. They didn't follow him around and pick up his used Coke cans, which they could have done. Instead, they got an order, court order. They went to the local health clinic. They got one of his daughter's pap smears. They ran the CODIS markers, the identifying genetic information on the daughter's pap smear tissue from it, and said, yes, the person who left the DNA at the crime scene could have been her father. At which point they arrested him, did a DNA test on him. It was a perfect match. As our DNA sequences become more available in health records and so on, they become more available to all sorts of people, including people with a court order. I'm not sure that's a bad thing, but the fact that the public doesn't have any clue that that may happen, and then it starts happening, I think would clearly be a bad thing. And I actually substantively think it may be a bad thing as well. So just more DNA out there, more potential uses, more potential mismatches between expectations and reality.
And just a quick question for George before we open it up to the audience for questions. So from the point of view of your consent, for people who are literally agreeing to have their genetic information available to the world, do you see that as a successful effort so far, that people truly understand it in a way that everyone would think they need to understand it, or how do you respond to that?
Well, again, I think we're not looking for anything beyond adequate consent. But I think the key component that we need, not just for people participating in medical research, but for the broad population, is education. We really need to have a lot more. The population has gone from almost zero education about computers to really quite sophisticated use of cell phones, which are now supercomputers. I think it's very important to get us up to that speed with genetics as too, and there's many models for that we could go into if we wanted to, including high school education. And in particular in our project, what we do is we require that they not just sign a consent form, but they actually get 100% on an entrance exam. And interestingly, and I know it's not a typical population, but it's not just people that have severely affected individuals. That's about a third of our population. Some are ancestry freaks, and some of them are healthy. There's all kinds. But anyway, that 100%, they take with some pride. They actually are excited about the fact that they learned enough to get 100% on that exam. And I think that's something that might be generalizable. And it was a kind of an accident that we noticed this pride that they're taking in it.
Latonya, quick comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring one example to light that I think kind of unifies it. A few years ago, I was asked by a very large organization, well, I don't think they want to be named. I was asked by Vanderbilt University to look at their effort in to build a pharmacogenomic database. And it turns out that the very way that they were trying to go about it is replicated throughout the country in almost every major healthcare location where that one healthcare organization has 70 or 80% of the market share. And coming from Pittsburgh, UPMC would be such an example. But in that particular case, over the years, they've kept the blood samples when patients would come in to have a test done, and they would keep that blood sample. And because they have most of the population, I actually was raised in Nashville, so my birth records are actually in that very database, and my mother's and my sisters and my cousins and so forth.
You were born in the United States.
I was born
in the... You can run for president.
No, no. And so what's interesting about it is because they have all of the clinical information, they can now say, well, you know what, we'll go through and we'll start sequencing the blood samples that we've held all these years. And we could have an incredible pharmacogenomic database. So they came up with this elaborate way to decouple identity from the records, from a copy of the records that would fall sort of on the other side of this wall. And the idea was in this de-identified world, they could do all kinds of things. They would still take lots of precautions, right? And then the law enforcement example was the first one I gave them. I said, you know what's going to happen? You're going to have this beautiful database, and some hideous crime is going to happen in Nashville, and the law enforcement is going to have a piece of DNA left. And is going to come with a search warrant and says, we want you to go through all of the names here to figure out which, in all the DNA here, to tell me who that person is. Is it a match in this database, and who is that person? You know you're good enough if you can't do that. And we couldn't find a way for that not to be the case. And so that's a particular situation where it's not, the informed consent, if it had been consented, would have had to have been so general in the beginning, as it will be in these blood spots in Texas as they go forward. It's so general, it's like the notices on your privacy notices on your webpage. Oh, and we can use your data for all these things and business analytics and everything else. And this kind of catch-all informed consent doesn't really get you to the place where it can come back and be sort of this disaster.
I guess on the other side, maybe one of the benefits of the Personal Genome Project is all the people who've given their DNA won't commit any crimes because they'll know that they're immediately going to be found out.
Just white-collar crimes.
Yeah, right, just white collar. So we're going to open this up to the audience for questions, to either the whole panel or any particular person. Yes?
Thanks very much. I wanted to ask about the open-sourced part of the panel topic. That's a metaphor of sorts for open source software. And the two features of open source software, such as it is, are that people contribute not for money, but because they see some greater good in the activity. They get something out of it, but there's also a sense of a larger thing they're a part of. And I guess the second thing is that to participate in open source software creation, you don't have to be accredited. You don't have to be part of a research institute or a computer science department or IBM. It's just sort of the proof is in the pudding. And that has been said to give the software industry and our digital ecosystem a huge boost, as out of those amateurs who are giving for fun, you can get things like the Apache web server and all sorts of advances. So I guess the question is whether the panel thinks there is a strong metaphor to this zone, that if you had people willing to give of their DNA voluntarily and not really in exchange for anything particularly back to them, but part of a common pool, and then imagined a bunch of software tools that people could use to, I don't know, query those who had donated any kind of survey question, ask them questions about their health, about what their favorite color is, and then try to go to town figuring out how to match up so-called genotype and phenotype that, ha-ha, we found that you like the color green gene. What do we do with it? I don't know, but it's interesting, sort of thing. I'm just curious what the empirical prospects are that you think that such a venture would yield rich insights in a way that the current, more constrained research establishment yields. And secondly, whether you'd imagine that could be pulled off in a way that would not end up with a privacy disaster.
I guess I should start. I think I have personally benefited quite a bit from the open source computer field, and also from the very great openness we've had in genomics up until the Human Genome Project was complete. At that instant, then we realized or actually up to that, we knew that we were going to have to get genomes and phenomes for many, many individuals. And fortunately, technology has now made that possible, and we're in this position. I think it's hard to imagine. I mean, I don't have much in the way of empirical evidence that inviting average or people around the world to contribute will be a benefit, but it certainly has been in these other two fields. And it's a very strong metaphor, in my opinion. We need at least a small cohort to do the experiment to see how we're doing on that, and I think it's an exciting experiment.
I could be wrong, but I have the understanding, someone knows differently, correct me, that right now, even with the Framingham Heart Study, DNA and all the information, there are people doing behavioral studies of that kind right now in the city of Boston. At least someone told me that there were. So I think now how they're handling that from a privacy point of view in some fashion, I simply don't know.
I was going to comment just on our experience with the alternative system is represented by a database called dbGaP that NIH runs. And one of my laboratory has some experience with getting access to it. It was quite a few hoops for a very talented person to get access. They're given limited access and all kinds of restrictions on what they can do with it. And it's very, very different from open source. It's very different from any previous genomics data set. And this individual just gave up on it, and basically the rest of the lab has as a consequence as well.
Phil?
Yeah, speaking very briefly to the open source question, I bring a different anecdote, but I think supports your point. I'm involved in a big study at WashU and the Data Safety Monitoring Board, and we attempted to have a group of parents of healthy children consent to a very minimal use of their healthy child's tissue with saliva. Our refusal rate approached 95%. Nobody wanted to do it. They didn't even want to put their child at risk to have saliva drawn from the mouth. We weren't even talking about DNA here. We were going to do a protein analysis of something. Then we went to the Attorney General of the state to get an opinion on whether or not, on the order of 40,000 newborn screening samples derived for testing purposes, could be tested anonymously, totally anonymously, to ask a single question about something related to surfactant deficiency. And the Attorney General would not permit the use of it. We couldn't even get beyond that. It was very much a closed source in those two instances.
I think the open empirical question is, will there be enough information altruists, which was a nice term that Zach Cohane at Harvard and Russ Altman wrote about. Will there be enough of them to make a big enough difference, provide enough data? That's an empirical question. How many people will do it? More than zero, because we've got a personal genome project out there with how many people in it?
16,000 so far.
Okay. More than zero. Will it be enough? For many purposes, you'll need lots and lots of data here, because there are lots of gene interactions, lots of different variations, lots of different phenotypes. You may need the 500,000 or so that the Brits are getting. If you've got full consent from people to do that, I'm all in favor of it, but there is a question mark. Will you get enough? And there's a second question mark. There is a potential confounding variable here. The people who are willing to volunteer may be different in some relevant way from the entire population in a way that will skew your results.
Quick response.
When I think of the open source, I see and I look over the environment right now in this space, I see two striking big differences. So when I look at the Personal Genome Project, you see this idea of people consenting. 23andMe would be another example of that. But we also see these gift databases, which is where, you know, I have a 3-year-old. If he had a disease and then we didn't have a discovery, I would be recruiting genetic information from all of you if that would help him. And so gift databases are where people are volunteering because they're trying to get a particular disease. But that, as Hank pointed out, that's not the masses of the population aren't so motivated. The second big observation, 3 observations. The second big observation I'd like to make is the identifiability or the explicitness at which people want to be identified in those databases. 23andMe, it's all explicit when you're inside, and then they got all huffity-puffity when somebody inside started telling leaking data from the inside out. They got very upset, felt there was they felt their trust had been violated, and so forth. As the number grows and there's money in those hills, or researchers want to get into that, they may see a lot more of that. They may begin to bring the size of those kinds of databases down. I very much admire the Personal Genome Project, but the truth is only 10 are explicitly identified online of those records, and the other ones are sort of de-identified. And it's not clear to me what the person whose data it is thinks. Do they think that their privacy is somehow protected by that data being de-identified? The last observation that I'd like to make is that in open source, in software, if I write some code and I stick it out there in open source, I don't lose my life insurance. I don't lose my disability insurance. The risk to me by participating in the open source community and computers is not a harm to me. But participating in these open sources can be a harm to those individuals.
Okay, go to another question. There.
In some sense, I want to ask the opposite of Jonathan's question. That if one were to try and imagine what a reasonable access barrier on collecting genomic data from masses, from wide parts of the population, would be, where would that line be drawn? Can one imagine one that will enable the advancement of science the way that we would like to see it advance, and would still provide sufficient protections, privacy protections to individuals in a way that they can understand? So would that be limiting access to the data to researchers with IRB approval? Would the data be available under a court order? Or does it really need to be available in a very public way, the way Jonathan imagines, or for use just for specific purposes that are can be explained clearly to the individual at the time of collecting the data?
Who wants to pick that up?
I can imagine such a system. It's too long to go into detail on now, but it would, for me, it would have to have some level of consent. People would have to know that they were giving their DNA for research and some general view of what the research was. In addition to that, it would have to have some ongoing governance structure about what research uses actually were made of that, and it would have to be coupled with some kinds of social protections against negative effects. It has to be coupled, I think, with continued information back and forth with the subjects, so they know what's happening with their data, so they know whether they want to withdraw on other things. I think it can be done, but it's not as cheap as just taking, 10,000 bloods that have previously been collected and sequencing them. Talking with people is really expensive, and research budgets don't like it. An hour of a trained person talking to a potential subject is a big expense, and some of them will say no. So I think we have to face the fact that if we want to do this ethically, it's going to cost some money.
Picking up.
Dr. Seidman.
Oh,
Well, I want to thank all of you for these really thoughtful comments, and I want to raise a question with regard to a word you've all used, which is consent. Because I think that unlike the 10K UK project, where there is a single form of approach and information provided to the subjects, we in America have innumerable consents at innumerable institutions that vary widely. And I wonder how much of that you see as a fundamental problem and if there are ways to address it. My second question relates to where does consent end? Because DNA, as you've all alluded to, is heritable, and your first-degree family members will share considerable amounts of it with you. Therein lies an issue with regard to who is allowed to use the information after the person giving consent has died. So I'd be curious of your thoughts on both of those.
I'll jump in first. I think that might be a place where I think George and I both agree, because we both sort of are saying, in a way, consent is kind of dead. Not privacy, consent is dead. And what I'd like to see consent replaced with is actually contracts. That is the idea that if it's, that my information, I have a sense of a kind of property ownership of a copy of it. That doesn't mean that there aren't other copies that people can do with whatever rules and regimes already exist. But I could easily imagine a version of data, a repository in which individuals get a copy of their own data, and a marketplace idea where you take the data, but in fact a stronger legal instrument would be a contract where what I'm getting back for it is a kind of protection against harm, whether that's compensation, whether it's an insurance policy, whatever that might be. But some way in which the market is protecting the individual. That's a model I would like to see us move towards as we look at these personal health records and other kinds of personal repositories where people are getting more and more and putting more and more information that they could append to and annotate to their record, likely to become a very comprehensive, richer source of data.
George?
I'd like to address the second question about family. Many IRBs feel that the individual is paramount. Their decision about themselves and their information trumps their family. And that was certainly the case for our IRB. They said that we didn't have to check with the family. We nevertheless institute a policy of checking with all the first-degree relatives as a prerequisite and as one of the questions on the exam. Furthermore, we're specifically recruiting multiple family members so that you don't have just one family member representing the entire family. So if you can get 3 family members to agree to participate like a trio that has genetic advantages, technological advantages, and consenting advantages, I think.
Actually, I have a second-year law student who wrote a great paper for me. She's an identical twin. Right. So if her evil twin sister, although her sister thinks she's the evil twin, but if the twin gets sequenced, if the twin joins George's program or does something else, that's her information as well. Those are, I like George's approach. I don't know that I would require us to go that far, but the idea of at least thinking about the fact that your DNA is not just your DNA is important. On the consent point, I'm not sure that it's a problem that we've got 1,000 forms. I think the problem is we have 1,000 bad forms. They tend to be, thanks to me and a bunch of other lawyers, they tend to get longer and longer and longer every year. Every time we think of something new, it's another paragraph. I think we need to, and whether we call it consent or permission or contract, there's some variations there. I don't much care as long as somebody is knowingly giving you permission to do research with their DNA. I think we need to explore different ways to kind of convey that information. More use of video, more use of web, DVD. Nobody reads those things, and the people who read them don't understand them. It's a lawyer's fiction. The consent form is a lawyer's fiction that has very little to do with the real world. It's like the last time I had to upgrade my iTunes. I actually downloaded the new contract. It's 14 single-space pages. I owe Steve Jobs a piece of my liver. No, not really, but nobody looks at those things. So we need better ways to give people a fighting chance to have some idea what they're agreeing to. And consent forms, and even the conversations that in theory the consent form is just reflecting, are not effective ways, have not proven to be very effective ways to do that.
Cricket, do you want to give a quick response? Because I know you have a program at the Brigham and Women's that you're very happy with.
You think you've got one good consent form?
Well, no, we have organized a biobank to recruit samples broadly from, we've organized a program called Our Genes, Our Health, Our Community, which tries to recruit samples from every patient consented, linked to their longitudinal medical record with family information and epidemiologic information, where they lived when they were 12, 15, et cetera, et cetera. And it is a very lengthy consent purpose. It takes a lot of time. It only takes about 45 minutes. There's information sent in advance in the mail in Spanish and or English, and then there's a face-to-face meeting, and our success rate of recruitment is over 60%, and it's going extraordinarily well. I do think, however, that we all recognize that if I were to move to another institution, or that patient were to move to another physician care, academic healthcare center, they'll be faced with a different consent form. And I think this really is a huge burden in terms of being able to have our public educated about what we're talking about, because we use different words and they have different meanings. I think we need a universal consent form. I don't care what it's, a contract, a consent, a something.
Two comments. First to my left.
So if I could just add a footnote to your important point. And I realize this is somewhat provocative. I think the IRB structure in America is long overdue for review and revision. It was created a long time ago on a very small base of regulatory guidance. And I think Hank would agree with me here, if you go back to the creation of the documents and how they've been used, they were based on the notion of physical risk of harm, not informational risk of harm. And I really think one of the great benefits that will come from genome age will be a rethinking of how we should deal with this information. But to do it well, we have to have a rethinking about how IRBs operate, in my opinion.
Christine, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to throw something else in the ring, really, which you alluded to earlier, was the sort of growing concern about how we feed back findings of clinical significance, so-called incidental findings. They're not really incidental. We know they'll be there in a certain proportion. And the issue about taking consent for what range of potential gene deletions you might feed back in that have clinical significance, I think is an enormous issue. And we think it's costly to perhaps get proper consent and run longitudinal studies now. The costs of feeding back information in an appropriate way and deciding what information to feed back and how to feed it back are going to be enormous.
I think we'll move to one other question. The hand back there. Yes? No? You are looking around? Yep.
Thank you. I'm John Taysom, and in my day job, I'm a venture capitalist based in the UK, but I'm here at Harvard for a year on a fellowship to set up a not-for-profit, which is an endowed not-for-profit, which will house the ID to behavioral characteristic mappings. It turns out in commercial applications, and my investments are in security and ad tech, in commercial applications, a lot of the benefit that commercial users need can be obtained from clusters of information. And across broad swathes of medical diagnosis, it turns out from discussions with primary care physicians that diagnosis can be largely derived from clusters. Does that approach have any application in the treatment of genetic data?
Everyone's looking at you.
I'll tackle it. So I think we actually had a version of this conversation before, but I'll now share it with everyone. If it were 20 years from now, and research goes on in this space, we could then say, aha, you know what I really need from anyone? I don't need your full genome, I need this SNP, or I need this or that, and so forth. And we could begin to then really talk about anonymization or de-identification in a sort of way, because in some sense, the reason we need everything right now is because we don't actually know what we're looking for. But once we actually knew what we were looking for, then I can just ask about a particular gene, or I could ask about a particular slice of information. And then you can imagine not everyone for every decision has to have as much information as they do now. So I think that's someplace that we could actually go by using a kind of clustering analysis. But I can't get the clusters. I don't know the groupings right now. And that's the hard part. How do we get from there to this other place?
Dr. Kuchilapati, you had your hand up a moment ago.
I think it's very important to be able to make a distinction between the uses of the genetic information. Phil pointed out that if you were obtaining genetic information, whether it's 1 gene or 10 genes or 100 genes or the whole genome for a clinical purpose, that's a completely different type of situation. And so when you go to your physician, you don't give the person consent to be able to measure your cholesterol levels. In a similar fashion, if there's something wrong and you go to the pediatrician and be able to say that something wrong with my child, and say, let's send this out for the DNA from this child for a test, you don't get a consent for that. And clearly there are examples today of whole genome sequencing that would be very important to diagnose particular types of diseases. So those are one class of things. And the second class of things that we have to separate is that if people give DNA for research purposes, what is the kind of consent that you have to obtain from them? So I think we're making a broad strokes here that everything is one thing, but it isn't one, and we have to distinguish between the two.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes left for this segment, so I'm going to ask people if they wish to give short responses. If they want to.
I would agree with your last point. I think the doctrine of implied consent is at work for most aspects of medicine, short of particular things like surgery. And I think it would remain that way, and we should separate these two distinctions that you spoke of.
I do think that research and clinical consents are different, in part because the patient expects something of personal benefit from the clinical intervention that they do not expect from the research, or should not expect from the research connection. We do, however, get consents for quite a few clinical things, including perhaps more than you realize. But I think in theory, the consent should be viewed as somewhat different, and it is because there is a real reason, a personal interest in the clinical interaction that doesn't necessarily exist with respect to the research interaction, except with the information altruists who have an altruistic motive.
Do we have time for one last question in the back?
Quick one. What happens if I want to withdraw my consent, where you have a long trail potentially that has developed? And 2, what happens if there's something wrong, such as in one's credit report, that can never get fixed?
I like that question a lot. I like the question because some of the models that we've talked about today, you as the individual would never know your data was there. So the idea that, like at least in the credit report, there's a place I could go. I could know the places I could figure out who's looked at it, or at least I know who's reported to it, and I can edit it and so forth. But a lot of these systems, IRB approvals, regulatory requirements, and so forth, do not require any knowledge of the individual and don't require any consent from the individual. And so a lot of the models that we do see are in that vein. And so as a result, I don't actually know when I'm the patient and I'm the subject of that data, all the places it could be, which means it could actually come out of this umbrella, go to someone who actually does harm me. I could be harmed and not even know why. And so I think that was a really good point. But on the kinds of models that we've talked about today, where the patient is a first-hand participant, then that's very different. I like contract over consent because of things like I can say we can come to an agreement, and if you don't adhere to it, I don't need HHS's Office of Civil Rights to come after you. I don't need to go convince some regulatory group to come after you. I can just sue you. And that may not be a small task, but the point is I have a private right of action that I don't enjoy now, And that actually gives individuals a lot more power than we have now.
So is it plausible that the legal system will make such a transition to contracts rather than consent, as was described?
Well, in the model that I pose, it doesn't require the legal system to do anything. It doesn't require one regulation to change. It just simply is taking advantage of today's environment where we just simply build a repository. We allow people to have their data, and we just simply say, now, any researcher who wants to come and do a study and pull data out of here, you have to make an arrangement with each of the individuals.
I think there would be resistance to going to a contract model for consent, and that resistance would heavily come from the institutions involved. Because if you've got a contract, then you've got obligations to the subjects. Right now, the institutions love to play consent. The subjects have obligations to us. They've given us stuff, but we don't have any obligations to them. And I blame my brothers and sisters in the law to some extent for this, but there would be a lot of pushback from the institutions to go into a contract model, I think.
Oh, okay, I think we're going to conclude this panel. I want to thank the panelists for their discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.